Tonight, picture a street of cobbles glistening under torchlight, the waxy smoke of tallow candles drifting out of a Guildhall door, voices inside low and serious. You stand outside, the wooden door barred not with iron but with custom, and custom is heavier than any lock. Women in your shoes, centuries ago, might pass by here often, carrying baskets of bread, spinning wool or holding a child's hand, yet the glow inside, the business of craft and contract, remained beyond their reach. The fire was for others. You'd probably never make it through a single medieval night. But don't worry, I'll guide you safely through. So before we go any further, if this quiet company helps, you can gently tap like and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Maybe lying awake in New York, or drifting in a quiet room in London. Drop your time and place below, so none of us feel alone tonight. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey, together, here on Timeless Sleep. The Guildhalls rise like fortresses in stone towns across Europe, their coats of arms painted bright against age-darkened beams. Step through one, and you'd hear the scrape of chairs on planks, the rustle of parchment, the clink of pewter cups. Apprentices in coarse tunics whisper at the back, waiting to be judged by masters in fur-trimmed gowns. This is where bakers decide who may bake, where masons set wages, where goldsmiths guard secrets more fiercely than monks guard relics. But if you were a woman, the threshold itself was forbidden ground. Guilds were jealous keepers of privilege. They gave apprenticeships only to boys, carefully selecting sons of free men, or, if fortune smiled, a promising nephew. The daughter might inherit a loom, or a knack for brewing ale, yet guild statutes were clear. No woman may take oath. No woman may rise as master. At best, a widow could carry on her husband's trade, but always under his shadow. Her work counted as his legacy, not her skill. Candles sputter, dripping tallow on the oak benches. The parchment is unrolled, its ink dense and crabbed. The words matter less than the tone. Protection, purity, preservation. Men feared that if women entered freely, guild secrets would leak into kitchens, into whispers between families, into corners where no master had authority. Better to keep the circle closed, and so it stayed. Of course, women still worked, but invisibly. Picture the streets outside. You pass a weaver's house and hear the beat of the shuttle. Inside, the wife has her hands as busy as her husband's, but only his name will appear on contract. You pass the tavern, and behind the counter, a woman draws ale into mugs. For centuries, women brewed more ale than men, yet in guild books, only brewers, male, are recorded. Women were alewives, a word that carried more scorn than respect, like calling someone a hobbyist when they're really carrying the market. One guild record from London even notes, almost nervously, that women meddle too much in the trade. The solution? Fines and prohibitions. You can almost hear the men muttering in their smoky hall. Better to drive them out before they drive us out. It's not only London. In Florence, guilds guarded silk production fiercely, yet in truth, women's fingers spun much of that silk in cramped rooms where no candle burned. In Paris, washerwomen lined the Seine, their chatter rising above splashes, their bodies bent under sodden cloth. None of them were guild members. None could bring disputes before guild courts. If a cloth tore or customer complained, the woman bore the blame alone, with no charter to defend her. Let's pause to notice something. Guilds weren't simply workplaces. They were medieval LinkedIn, insurance agency, union, and supper club rolled into one. Membership gave you status, protection, a voice in city affairs. Being excluded meant being voiceless in more ways than one. And here lies the paradox. Women's hands shaped bread, cloth, and ale, the staples of medieval life. Yet those hands were written out of the story the moment parchment met ink. like erasing someone from a group photo, but leaving the space where they stood faint and empty. Still, some exceptions slip through. In Cologne, a few women are listed as brewers in guild roles, tolerated perhaps because their husbands had died. In York, widows sometimes continued the trade long enough to raise sons into it, but always provisional, always temporary. A woman was a stopgap, not a master in her own right. It almost makes you wonder, what if guilds had opened their doors? Imagine a hall filled with the scent of yeast and hops, with both men and women debating fair prices. Picture a weaving guild where daughters inherited looms as easily as sons. Perhaps fashion itself would look different today, if women's creativity had been recognized instead of hidden behind curtains. Now, here's a strange tidbit. In 14th century London, alewives were so common that they became stock characters in plays, often mocked for watering down drinks. But records show that men watered ale too. They just weren't the ones blamed in songs and satire. That's the thing about exclusion. It rarely plays fair. Another image for you. A boy apprentice, barely 12, trudges home with sawdust on his cloak. His sister of the same age is home at the hearth, spinning wool until her fingers ache. Both are learning trades. Only one will ever be called trained. It's tempting to think, well, those were the times, but peek at another world, far away. In some Islamic cities, women had guild-like associations of their own, small but real. A group of female bathhouse workers in Cairo could band together, demand fair pay, even arbitrate disputes, not perfect, but less invisible. Europe might have learned from them, if only it had looked beyond its own walls. Yet here in these stone towns, the reality hardens. Torches smoke in the guild hall rafters, and you shiver outside, pressed to the cold wall. A gust of wind rattles the shutters, carrying with it the scents of roasted onions and stale beer. A dog noses past your feet, ignored by the masters inside. That dog, in truth, might have had more chance of warmth tonight than you. A modern aside slips in. When you think of networking events today, maybe with awkward name tags and trays of free crackers, you realize medieval people had them too. Only, instead of business cards, they swapped oaths. Instead of resumes, they held apprenticeships. And just like now, the trick wasn't just skill, it was access. Women had none. Still, outside the hall, life is not silent. You hear a laugh, high, quick, not from the guild but from a group of women, weaving stories while mending clothes by lantern light. They make their own network, though no parchment records it. Gossip becomes currency. Shared tricks of brewing or spinning become informal apprenticeship. If guilds were official libraries, these circles were whispered footnotes, vital but unsung. And here's a small joke for you. A medieval proverb claimed, "A woman's tongue wags like a mill." Perhaps true, but you might note, mills ground the grain that fed the city. Maybe wagging tongues were just as essential. So, the candles burn lower in the hall. Men vote on fines, on who may open shop, on what the price of bread should be. You, standing outside, realize the whole city is divided by one simple threshold, the oaken door, barred not by lock, but by custom. And so we begin with candles and guild halls, symbols of exclusion that flickered across every medieval town, burning bright for some and leaving others, especially women, in the shadow. The night lingers, damp with mist, and you move away from the guild hall's glow into narrow alleys where the air smells of wood smoke and tanners' vats. Here the cobbles are slick, and you notice doorways sunk low, the homes of ordinary families where candles sputter faintly. Inside those wooden rooms, learning, or its absence, begins at birth. For a boy, the path may start with letters scratched into wax tablets, a parish clerk guiding his hand, or a master teaching him to read psalms. For a girl, the wax tablet is rarely offered. Instead, her fingers are wrapped around a spindle, twisting flax into thread before she can count beyond her toes. Literacy, the gatekeeper to almost every higher profession, is already tilted against her. Tonight, picture a little girl seated by the hearth, the fire staining her cheeks red, her mother handing her a distaff. The wool feels rough, the rhythm endless. "This will feed you," her mother says. Not unkindly, books never will, for centuries. That single lesson closed more doors than iron bars. Monasteries and cathedral schools taught boys not only Latin, but the arithmetic of trade, the rhetoric of law, the geometry of building. The curriculum, heavy with Aristotle and canon law, prepared them for church, court, and commerce alike. Girls, unless noble or destined for a convent, they rarely saw a classroom. Some cities banned female pupils outright. In Bologna's records, for example, women appear in margins, a father requesting his daughter join lessons, often denied. The result is stark. Professions requiring literacy, law, medicine, teaching, excluded women almost automatically. Imagine applying for a modern job without being allowed to learn how to type. Not a chance, yet pockets of resistance existed. In Paris, a few merchant daughters learned to read account books, at least enough to keep trade flowing while their fathers travelled. In England, noble women sometimes learned French and Latin to manage estates. Still, such cases were exceptions, and exceptions proved the rule. A woman had to be extraordinary merely to reach the starting line. Here's a curious tidbit. Margery Kempe, the English mystic of the early 15th century, dictated the first known autobiography in English because she herself could not read or write. She had to employ a priest to put her visions into words. A whole life, a torrent of voices, dependent on someone else's pen. Pause with that image, you, with stories in your mind, unable to scratch them onto parchment without a man to mediate. It is a kind of silencing, not by force but by absence. Meanwhile, the boys progress. At 7, they join grammar schools, chanting declensions until voices crack. At 14, they may apprentice not just in craft but in letters, a scrivener, a clerk. Each step is a rung up a ladder, barred to sisters standing at the same hearth. The church's role cannot be ignored. Priests preached that women were more prone to sin if taught letters. They might read love charms or heretical tracts. Better to leave them illiterate, safe within obedience. A bishop in the 13th century even thundered, "A woman who hews is a woman who errs." You might smile at the exaggeration, but it shaped real households where fathers decided education was wasted on daughters, and yet, ironically, religious women were sometimes the best educated of all. Nuns in convents learned to read psalters, to copy manuscripts, to sing plain chant. Hildegard of Bingen composed entire works of theology and music, her visions dazzling even popes, but this option came with a cost. Cloistered walls, vows of chastity, and a life severed from the world's trades. Education was granted, but at the price of freedom. Think of it as being given the key to the library but locked inside it. Now, outside cloisters, the gulf widens. Literacy is not simply about reading prayers, it governs contracts, property rights, even recipes for advanced medicines. A woman barred from letters cannot easily argue in court, cannot draft a will, cannot record a formula for remedies she invents. Her knowledge remains oral, vulnerable to being dismissed as gossip. Here's a light joke tucked into the dark. If medieval exams had included questions on laundry, herbs or birthing pains, women would have scored top marks every time. But the syllabus was designed by men, for men, around men's concerns. So, the grades stayed out of reach. Picture a city street in the morning. Boys carry satchels of parchment, hurrying to lessons, the air sharp with frost. A girl the same age trudges the other way, a basket of cabbages on her hip, her hair damp with mist. Both learn discipline. One memorizes Cicero. The other memorizes the rhythm of market prices and the sound of hens about to lay. but only one is deemed educated. You might wonder, were medieval people blind to talent? Not entirely. Some fathers privately tutored daughters. Christine de Pizan, the famed French writer, learned from her father, an Italian court scholar. When widowed, she supported her children by writing, a rare case of pen, as profession for a woman. But Christine herself wrote bitterly of how unusual her chance had been, how men ridiculed her for even attempting it. Meanwhile, universities bloomed. Paris, Bologna, Oxford, halls echoed with arguments about Aristotle and Galen. Students caroused, quills scratched, ideas pulsed through candlelit dormitories, but women were absent. No female student, no female lecturer. It was not until centuries later that universities opened their gates, but by then the medieval pattern was set. Think about it. Knowledge itself became a kind of guild. Membership required Latin, logic, the oath of scholars. Women, excluded from schooling, could not even approach the door. The library was another guild hall, its oaken doors just as heavy, and literacy linked to power. Kings and nobles issued charters, signed treaties, passed edicts. Scribes controlled the record. A woman might rule a household with wit and economy, yet without the written word, her governance left little trace. Power without ink is like a bird with clipped wings. It may flap, but it cannot fly far. Still, let's soften the mood with one strange, almost comic image. In medieval illustrations, sometimes animals are drawn reading books. A rabbit with spectacles, a dog peering at a scroll. Satire. Yes, but also an irony. Artists could imagine literate beasts before they imagined literate women as normal. So the night deepens. In a narrow house, a girl squints at a scrap of parchment her brother left behind. She cannot make sense of the black lines, yet she traces them with her finger, curious. That curiosity will never be nourished in school. Tomorrow she will return to spinning, to fetching water, to marriage. Her brother will return to the master's bench, one step closer to profession. You might sigh at the unfairness, and you'd be right, but this is the quiet truth of learning blocked at birth. Education, or its denial, shaped who could become lawyer, doctor, clerk, and who would forever remain just a wife, servant, or silent laborer. And in that silence, history lost countless voices, voices we can only imagine now, as we drift deeper into this story, carried by candlelight and cobblestones, down the corridors where women's footsteps echoed, but never left a written trace. The mist clears, and you find yourself walking along a high stone wall, its cold surface glistening with dew. A bell tolls from within, low, resonant, solemn, and the sound rolls over the countryside like a heavy blanket. Tonight let me take you into the cloister, one of the few doors women could enter if they sought knowledge, protection, or purpose beyond marriage. Yet that door, while opening to education, closed to almost every profession outside its wall. The convent stands apart from the town, hedged by orchards and gardens. Herbs grow thick near the cloister walk, the air pungent with sage and rosemary. Inside, candle flames quiver against plaster walls as nuns file into choir stalls, their white wimples like pale lanterns in the dimness. A novice clutches her psalter, lips moving over Latin words she barely understands, but she will learn them in time. Here reading is allowed, even expected. Strange, isn't it? On the outside, women were told letters would corrupt them, but here behind stone and vow, letters became their daily bread. It was an odd bargain. Education could be yours, but only if you swore never to marry, never to bear children, never to step fully back into the bustling world. Knowledge in exchange for seclusion. It's like someone offering you the best library card imaginable, but the fine print says you can't ever leave the library. Still, what a library it was. Convents copied books by hand. Nuns illustrated manuscripts, their paints made of crushed minerals and egg yolk, their patience stitched into every golden letter. Think of Hildegard of Bingen, her visions filling parchment with mystical language, her music swelling through vaulted chapels. She wrote on medicine too, compiling knowledge of herbs that doctors later used, though often without crediting her. The cloister gave her a pen, but the world outside still hesitated to acknowledge it. Now picture the daily rhythm. The bell drags you from sleep before dawn. You shuffle in the chill to matins, the chanting deep and steady, a tide of syllables in Latin. After prayers you work, copying scripture, tending gardens, teaching the younger girls their letters. At midday, a sparse meal of bread, pottage, maybe a fish if fortune smiles. Then more study, more work, more prayer. By dusk your eyes burn from candle smoke, but your mind hums with lines of the Psalms. For a girl of peasant birth, this life could be a ladder. Imagine being one of 10 children in a cramped hut. Too many mouths for the farm. Your family sends you to the convent. Here, instead of endless drudgery, you have a bed of your own, food regular if plain, and the miracle of books. You learn to sing, to read, to write. You rise in rank, maybe even become abbess. You hold keys to storerooms, oversee lands gifted by nobles, correspond with bishops. In some ways, you wield more authority than most married women ever dream of. But of course, there's the wall. Those same gifts chain you inside. You cannot step out and practice law, though you can read canon law. You cannot become a doctor, though you can heal with herbs. You cannot open a workshop, though you can manage estates. Knowledge is yours, profession is not. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some convents were renowned for their brewing. Yes, cloistered women made ale, an excellent ale at that. Travellers praised it. Yet unlike their male counterparts, nuns rarely built breweries into large commercial ventures. Why? Their rule discouraged commerce, so while monks' beer built empires of profit, nuns' beer stayed within cloister walls, remembered only in scattered notes. And let's not romanticize. Convent life wasn't always peaceful. Some were poor, their roofs leaking, meals sparse, discipline harsh. In one account, nuns rebelled by secretly slipping out, meeting friends, or even running away. Others fought abbesses in disputes as bitter as any town feud. Cloisters could be hotbeds of politics, gossip, even scandal. Yet in the larger medieval world, they remained defined as the proper place for women who wanted letters. It was safer for men to imagine educated women hidden behind stone, chanting at dawn, than outside debating in the marketplace. Now let me draw you a little picture. A scribe monk and a scribe nun both dip their quills into ink. The monk copies Aristotle, the nun copies Psalms. The monk may go on to argue in universities, his words shaping law and science. The nun's work will remain in her cloister, sung softly by her sisters, rarely carried into the wider current of knowledge. Same ink, same patience, different destinies, and yet those hidden manuscripts matter. Scholars today marvel at their artistry. Without those quiet hands, much of medieval learning would have slipped into dust. So even as women were barred from professions, their cloistered labour held the line against forgetfulness. Here's a light joke, bedtime soft. If medieval parents had wanted their daughters to avoid gossip, they shouldn't have put them in cloisters, for though silence was a vow, anyone who's ever lived in close quarters knows whispering is as natural as breathing. Imagine the sound of nuns at laundry, splashing water, murmuring about abbesses' decisions, or a visiting bishop's odd cough. Cloisters were not immune to chatter. They simply gave it Latin phrases. A modern aside creeps in. Think of a college campus today, with its libraries, dormitories, lectures, and rules. In some ways, convents were medieval campuses for women. Only, once you enrolled, you never graduated. But not every woman welcomed this path. Many entered unwillingly, sent by families who couldn't afford dowries. To such women, the cloister was a cage. Letters of complaint survive, some begging release, some turning to rebellion. Others accepted the bars and made music within them. That's the paradox. For every Hildegard finding her voice, another nameless girl sang the same chant daily, her own voice fading into anonymity. Still, if you tilt your head, you can see glimmers of profession within. An abbess could be shrewd, negotiating rents with lords, managing farmland, resolving disputes. She acted much like a CEO, though she'd never be called such. In letters she signed with authority, yet her power was spiritual, not professional. Always the caveat, always the narrowing. Step back outside the wall now. The townsfolk glance at the convent and nod. They respect the nuns. Yes, but they also view them as set apart, not part of the guilds, not part of the professions. Inside, a scribe illuminates a page with blue and gold, her brush steady. Outside, a mason builds the city's new tower. One work lasts within cloister walls, the other shapes the skyline. Both matter, but only one is counted in civic roles. And that is the quiet tragedy of cloistered options. An entire stream of female intellect contained, precious, shimmering, yet damned before it could flow freely into the wider world. So, when we speak of medieval women and professions, remember this. If she wanted learning, her best chance was behind a wall. There she could chant, copy, brew, heal, even govern within limits. But to step beyond, to claim a chair in a guild hall or a lecture in a university, that path ended at the cloister gate. The bell tolls again, long and low. Candles gutter in the draught. The sisters rise for compline, their voices soft, steady, weaving Latin syllables into the night. Outside, the town settles, oblivious, and you stand by the wall, feeling both the promise and the loss. Education given, professions denied, the cloistered bargain written in stone. The dawn comes pale, a thin smear of grey over rooftops, and the smoke from chimneys curls upward into the chill. The market bell rings, and you follow the shuffle of townsfolk as they step into a new day. The convent walls lie behind you now. Ahead, another destiny for women opens, though not a profession in the guild or the court. Instead, marriage itself becomes a kind of career, expected, structured and measured by duties rather than choice. Tonight, picture a wooden door swinging wide on its leather hinges. Inside a hall, long tables grown with bread, stewed beans, a haunch of pork if the family is lucky. The air smells of wood smoke and roasted onion. At the head of the board sits the father, his daughters moving about with pitchers of ale, their heads bowed slightly, their hands quick. From birth they are trained for this role, for the unending profession of wifehood. It begins early. A girl of 12 may already hear whispers of suitors. A dowry is discussed. 2 cows, perhaps a strip of land, maybe bolts of cloth. The girl herself rarely speaks in the bargain. Her value is not her skill in craft or knowledge of books, but her capacity to link households, to bear heirs, to keep bread from burning and cloth from mildew. Marriage is not described as employment, but if you tilt your head, the parallels shine. There's recruitment, matchmakers, contracts, marriage charters, probation, the first nervous years in her husband's house, and daily labour without wage. The difference is she cannot resign. And oh, the labour! Step into a medieval home and look around. The wife kneads bread at dawn, the flour dusting her lashes. She milks cows, stirs pottage, tends the garden, spins thread, weaves cloth, brews ale, raises children, and oversees servants if she's lucky enough to have any. Each task is unending, circular. Bread consumed means more bread to knead tomorrow. Spun wool becomes cloth that wears thin, demanding more spinning. It is a treadmill disguised as duty. Now, here's the trick. None of it counts as profession. In town rolls, only her husband is listed as brewer, weaver, merchant. Yet much of his output is her sweat, her skill, her sharp reckoning of accounts when coins run short. The medieval household was a workplace, yet the wife's work vanished into invisibility. Think of the phrases help meet, good wife, housewife. Even the language reduces her labor to support rather than centrality. And if she failed, if the ale soured, if the loom broke, if the garden withered, the shame fell not only on her but on the household name. Imagine a job where your review was public, your failures judged at market stalls and parish benches, but your successes never earned a title. Still, some wives turned household duties into quiet power. In merchant families, wives managed books, weighed coin, negotiated prices in their husband's absence. Chronicles note them, faintly, as capable wives. Yet once again, capability did not translate to profession. If a widow continued the business, it was tolerated only until a son came of age. Then the ledger passed out of her hands. There's a quirky tidbit. In parts of Flanders, wives stood in marketplaces, hawking cloth beside their husbands, their cries as loud as any man's. Yet guilds wrote them out of statutes, dismissing them as assistants. Meanwhile, satirical poems poked fun at nagging wives who meddled in trade. Society noticed their presence, but mocked it instead of acknowledging it. Marriage also welded women to dependence. A wife was under her husband's legal guardianship. In many regions, she could not own property, sue in court, or sign contracts without his consent. Imagine having all the responsibility of managing a household economy, but none of the legal standing to defend it. It's like being made CFO of a company, but forbidden to sign a single check. And yet, marriage was near universal. For most women, there was no other route. Convents offered escape for a few. Professions were barred. Marriage was survival. The church praised it. Towns enforced it. Families expected it. A woman without husband or convent was labeled vagrant, spinster, loose. So the role of wife became her assigned career, whether she wished it or not. Picture now a wedding scene. The church smells of beeswax and damp stone. The bride stands in a gown of dyed wool, the groom beside her. Words are spoken in Latin, incomprehensible to many attending, but binding nonetheless. A ribbon ties their hands, symbolizing union. She lowers her gaze. The vows are not employment contracts, but in practice they dictate her daily work for the rest of her life. The irony: the same church that forbade women from priesthood elevated marriage as their sacrament. One door shut, another door locked from the inside. Yet don't imagine all wives silent or passive. Records tell of spirited women who managed estates when their husbands went to war, who led workshops, who argued in marketplaces with sharp tongues, a legal case in York. Records a wife standing up to creditors, her voice so loud the scribe noted it with surprise. But such moments are fragments, not the whole story. The system pressed most women back into their kitchens, their voices muffled by custom. Here's a light joke to soften the ache. One medieval proverb quipped, "A good wife is worth her weight in gold. A bad wife weighs more than a millstone." Charming, isn't it? Imagining medieval men comparing spouses as if they were grain sacks. It's the kind of humor that makes you roll your eyes even across centuries. A modern aside flickers in. Today we debate unpaid domestic labor and whether housework counts as work. Medieval women would have chuckled grimly. They knew the answer. Their work kept society alive, yet went unnamed, unwaged, uncounted. The medieval wife was the original essential worker, just without recognition. The day winds on. In the hall, the wife stirs a pot while children tug at her skirts. She checks the ale, feeds hens, cuts cloth for a new tunic. Her husband returns from Guildhall, contracts in hand. He speaks of trade, of politics, of profits. She nods, though she balanced the household economy while he was gone. Tomorrow, the tasks repeat. It isn't glamorous, but it is relentless, and it explains why so few women pressed beyond marriage into professions. There was simply no time, no energy, no cultural space left. To be a wife was already full-time, overtime, lifetime. As dusk falls, candles flicker in small homes, wives tuck children onto straw pallets, bank fires lock doors against the night. Across Europe, millions of unseen hands keep bread from burning, wool from tangling, coin from vanishing. Their labor is vast, their recognition negligible. And so marriage, the one path open to nearly every woman, became both a role and a cage. It defined her worth, consumed her hours, and barred her from professions by swallowing all her strength, long before she could ever knock on the Guildhall door. The bell tolls again, the day closes, another circle of uncredited labour complete, and you, walking through the town, realise, in medieval life, marriage itself was the profession most women could never escape. The morning breaks over a quieter street, sunlight washing faint gold over half-timbered houses. You turn from the markets and guild halls toward the humbler corners of the town. The sound that guides you is not bells or proclamations, but the steady whir of spinning wheels, the rhythmic clack of looms, and the bubbling of small pots where herbs steep into home remedies. Here is where women's hands never stopped moving, yet these crafts, though vital to survival, were pushed into the shadows of domestic duty rather than recognized as professions. Picture a single-room cottage. Smoke curls from the hearth, and in the corner a girl sits cross-legged, spinning flax into thread. The fibers catch in her hair, dusting her like cobwebs, and the spindle hums with its quiet music. Across from her, her mother stirs a cauldron, barley mash thickening into the ale that neighbours will soon drink. At the back, another sister tends a loom, the warp threads strung tight as harp strings. A father or brother may take the goods to market, but here, in this dim space, the true making happens, spinning and weaving with the backbone of medieval economies. Cloth, after all, was currency as much as clothing. England's wealth flowed on wool, Flemish towns thrived on looms, Italian cities prospered on silks, and yet, though women spun and wove endlessly, guild charters claimed weaving as male work. Women were spinsters, a word that clung to them like dust, used later as a synonym for unmarried women, as though their whole identity boiled down to twisting thread. Imagine if every modern single woman was called secretary or cashier, and you glimpse how language itself diminished them. Brewing tells a similar story. For centuries, ale was women's business. In villages, wives brewed small batches for sale, their jugs lined on benches, the air rich with yeast and malt. They were known as alewives, and ballads teased them for weak drink or dishonest measures. But when beer production grew profitable, men seized control. By the late Middle Ages, brewing guilds formed, and women were nudged out. Their old trade turned into a male-dominated profession. It's a pattern you'll see again and again. Women pioneer, men institutionalize, women vanish from the records. Let's slip in a curious tidbit here. In some illustrations from the 14th century, alewives are drawn with foxtails hidden under their skirts, a visual joke accusing them of trickery. But foxes also symbolized cunning. In bestiaries, it's as if society knew these women were clever entrepreneurs, but instead of praising, they caricatured them. Inside homes, women's craft filled every spare moment. Lace-like embroidery decorated church linens, dye-pots bubbled with herbs, beeswax was moulded into candles. Each product bore the mark of skilled labour, but the church or the husband or the market claimed ownership. A woman might create a tapestry that hung in a lord's hall for centuries, but no name would be recorded beside it. The work survived, the worker did not. Pause and listen. The street outside hums with men calling prices, haggling, striking deals. Inside, the steady clack of a loom or the hiss of boiling wort goes unheard by chroniclers. The division between public and private, between professional and domestic, was less about skill and more about visibility. If your work happened in a hall or market, it was a profession. If it happened at a hearth, it was duty. And yet, these crafts demanded mastery. Spinning wasn't mindless. Different fibers required different tension. Brewing depended on precise timing, knowledge of seasons, the right vessel of clay or wood. Weaving required calculation of thread counts, pattern memory, dexterous hands. But because these arts were tethered to women, they became invisible economies. A light joke slips in. If medieval men had to wear only the cloth they wove themselves, half the nobility would have gone naked to court. Perhaps that's why women kept spinning, to save everyone else from embarrassment. Even healing, often performed by women, faced this division. Mothers and grandmothers passed down herb lore, knowledge of how chamomile soothed fevers, how sage cleansed wounds, how pennyroyal ended pregnancies. Such skills were invaluable, yet they were dismissed as household knowledge, while men with university training in Galen's texts became physicians. Imagine two patients, one tended by a mother with herbs, one by a man quoting Aristotle. Only one was called doctor, even if outcomes were the same. The irony deepens when you realize that many male doctors learned remedies from women, then published them under their own names. Recipes for ointments and poultices float in medieval manuscripts. Unattributed, stripped of their female origin, it's like someone today copying your grandmother's soup recipe, publishing it in a cookbook, and then being hailed as a culinary genius. Still, women found ways to weave resilience into their crafts. Informal networks of knowledge spread among them: how to dye wool with madder for richer red, how to sweeten ale with honey, how to save thread ends for mending. These networks were quiet, like underground rivers, feeding life without ever being mapped. Step into a marketplace, and you might catch glimpses of their presence. A wife sells spun thread, her fingers raw. Another hawks small jugs of ale, her apron stained with malt. Yet on the rolls of merchants and guilds their names are missing. They are wives of or widows of. Their crafts are noted only in passing, like shadows crossing the page. And sometimes ridicule was their reward. Alewives became comic figures in plays, portrayed as quarrelsome, greedy, ugly. Housewives were mocked for nagging tongues, spinners for gossiping at wheels. Society laughed at the very work that sustained it. A modern aside whispers in, imagine if every barista today were drawn in caricatures with devil horns, while the coffee chain CEO was praised as a visionary. That was the medieval pattern: mock the worker, elevate the master. Yet even ridicule cannot erase reality. The fact is, women spinning, brewing, weaving, and healing kept households, villages, and entire economies alive. The profession of wife may have consumed their names, but their hands shaped medieval survival. As evening falls, the clatter of looms quiets. Women stretch their backs, rub sore fingers, bank fires. A jug of ale is passed around. Children tug at skirts, and laughter rises despite fatigue. These crafts may have been unrecognized, but they bound communities together. And so, as you walk down the lane lined with cottages, the truth settles on you. Women's spinning, brewing, weaving, and healing were professions in all but name. They were dismissed as domestic, yet without them no guild, no manor, no kingdom could have stood. Their labor was the silent scaffolding of medieval life, sturdy, essential, invisible. The air thickens with wood smoke as you wander back toward the town's heart, where the great timber-framed Guildhall looms above the square. Torches sputter in iron brackets, their flames bowing in the breeze. The sound inside is muffled but commanding. The scrape of benches, the thud of boots, the low growl of voices debating fines, contracts, and the fate of trades. This is where the rules of labor are written, and where women, despite all their skill, are kept firmly at the threshold. Guilds were not just work clubs, they were fortresses of privilege, their walls built of parchment charters and sworn oaths. Membership determined who could bake bread, who could cut leather, who could carve stone, who could sell wine. To belong meant protection. If someone undercut your price, guild brothers rallied. If you fell sick, they helped your family. If you died, they buried you honorably. To be excluded meant drifting, unshielded, vulnerable. And women, almost always excluded. The guilds guarded their trades like jealous dragons, hoarding secrets, guarding apprenticeships, reserving the benefits for sons and nephews. A daughter might work her fingers raw at a loom, yet her labor was invisible the moment statutes were written. Picture the ritual. A boy of 12 stands before the guildmasters. The hall smells of ink, ale, and sweat. He places his hand on a holy relic, swears loyalty, pays his fee. In return, he becomes an apprentice. Years later, after toil and testing, he may rise to journeyman, then master, his name carved into rolls. His sister, though equally skilled, never touches that relic, never pays that fee, never sees her name inked. The door is barred, not by iron, but by words. Here's a curious tidbit. In some towns like Cologne and York, widows of guild members could temporarily inherit their husband's rights, running workshops until a son came of age. Imagine the irony. A woman's competence was admitted only when a man's absence demanded it. She became an acting master, like an understudy filling in, though she may have known the trade better than anyone. Once the son grew, the mother's role dissolved, as if she'd only borrowed the profession for a short season. But for most women, the guild's gates stayed shut. Statutes explicitly barred them. Some declared bluntly, "No woman shall be admitted." Others were more sly, requiring apprenticeships of 7 years, impossible for women who married young. A girl of 12 spinning wool might by 20 already be a wife and mother. Her chance at apprenticeship vanished with her childhood. Yet this didn't stop women from working. They labored beside their husbands, their fingers as skilled in carving, stitching, or brewing, but their names never appeared on charters. At best, they were called helpmeet. Imagine being a concert violinist forever listed as assistant to first violin. That was the reality of women in trades. A light joke emerges here. One medieval satirist claimed women weren't fit for guild membership because they would quarrel too much in meetings. As if men never argued. Picture a hall full of bakers shouting over the price of flour, and then claiming women were the quarrelsome ones. The hypocrisy practically steams off the parchment. The deeper truth was fear of competition. Women were numerous in brewing, cloth making, and market selling. Their skill threatened men's monopoly, so guilds drew lines, closing off entry, sometimes even fining men who employed women in workshops. Protectionism dressed as morality. Step closer to the hall. You can hear their voices echoing off beams, thick with ale and authority. They discuss weights, measures, apprenticeships, fees. They decide who may open a shop, whose bread is too light, whose leather is too thin. These decisions ripple into every household. Yet half the town, the women, have no voice in them. The irony stings. Guilds claim to uphold fairness and quality, yet fairness meant fairness for men only. A woman selling ale outside the guild's rules could be fined, her barrels confiscated. A woman weaving cloth might see her work dismissed as substandard without inspection. The guild's charter was not only a shield but also a weapon, and it was aimed squarely at keeping women out. Still, cracks appeared. In Paris, some female silk workers organized informally, creating their own networks of support. In London, women occasionally appear in court records defending their right to trade. These glimpses prove women's determination, though they rarely won in the long run. The guilds held the power of parchment and the ear of city councils. Think of the symbolism. The Guildhall is a house of flame-lit privilege, its doors carved with crests, its windows glowing at night. Outside, women sell bread rolls or thread in the dark, their voices swallowed by the wind. Inside, rules are written that bind them without ever hearing them. A modern aside creeps in. It's like watching a boardroom meeting today, where the decisions about equal opportunity are made by a table full of identical suits. The guilds weren't so different, echoing halls filled with men deciding who deserved to work. And yet, women's absence did not mean women's silence. In the gossip of markets, in the chatter at wells, in the negotiations of households, they formed their own invisible guilds. A neighbour taught another how to fret wool, how to sweeten ale, how to dye with woad. Knowledge passed sideways, outside charters, like underground currents feeding a parched field. There's one more curious detail. Sometimes guild charters allowed women to pay for membership in name only, not to practice, but to avoid penalties for selling goods. A cruel trick. They could buy the title, but not the voice or vote. Imagine paying gym fees, but never being allowed to touch the weights. The night deepens, the voices inside grow louder, tankards clink, decisions are sealed with wax, and you, standing in the square, feel the divide. The guilds stood as gatekeepers, their oaths carved in oak and parchment. For women, the gates stayed closed, no matter how skilled their hands, no matter how steady their work. And so the guilds, proud protectors of craft, became in truth the great silencers, their halls bright with fire, their rolls filled with names, while outside in the dark, women's labour continued unseen, uncounted, unremembered. The smell reaches you first, not incense or ale this time, but sharp herbs and pungent smoke drifting from a small cottage tucked near the edge of town. A woman leans over a steaming pot, stirring slowly, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. On the table beside her lie bunches of dried sage, sprigs of rosemary, jars of honey, and bundles of linen cloth. A baby cries in the next room, a boy coughs near the fire, and outside the door, a nervous neighbour waits. This is the world of medicine and midwives, where women's skills once held sway, until men began to fence it in. Like all the other trades, for centuries, healing was women's work. Mothers knew herbs for fevers, poultices for wounds, teas for cramps, ointments for burns. Midwives attended births, their hands steady, their voices low and coaxing in the midst of pain. They learned not from books but from practice, passed down knowledge from mother to daughter, aunt to niece, neighbour to neighbour. Their tools were simple: herbs, water, cloth, patience, prayer. Their profession was not called a profession, but it was indispensable. Picture a birth chamber. The shutters are closed, candles flicker, the air heavy with sweat and fear. The woman labours on a straw-stuffed mattress, her cries echoing in the rafters. Around her, female kin and neighbours murmur encouragement, while the midwife kneels at her side, soothing, checking, urging. She has no degree, no parchment, no seal, yet she has done this 100 times before. She knows when to wait, when to shift position, when to reach for herbs to ease the pain. She knows when the danger rises too high, when prayers must be whispered quickly. Without her, few babies would draw first breath. And yet, midwives lived in a fragile balance. On one hand, they were respected, even cherished, indispensable members of communities. On the other, their power unnerved churchmen and physicians alike. After all, they dealt with the mysteries of life and death, bodies and blood, things the male-dominated church found troubling. Their work could be praised as holy one day and suspected as witchcraft the next. Here's a curious tidbit. In some towns, midwives were required to swear oaths before bishops, promising not to use charms or superstitious rituals during births. Imagine that, a woman kneeling before a bishop, vowing to keep her craft pure, while the bishop himself had likely never attended a birth in his life. The irony is thick enough to stir with a spoon. Meanwhile, universities began training male physicians. They studied Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna, memorizing anatomy, humours, and Latin terms. Their tools were not herbs gathered from hedgerows, but parchment, ink, and authority. By the late Middle Ages, medicine was declared a learned profession, and by definition, a male one. Women, barred from universities, could not qualify. Midwives became tolerated only as assistants, not equals, and were slowly edged out of the medical sphere. Imagine the shift. A woman who had delivered dozens of healthy children could be dismissed as ignorant, while a man fresh from a lecture hall with no practice at all was hailed as doctor. It's the kind of absurdity that makes you want to laugh. Except the consequences were often tragic. Communities were forced to rely on men with theory but little experience, while the women with hands-on knowledge were sidelined or condemned. And yet, the midwives persisted. Their work was too necessary to vanish. Records from Strasbourg, from Florence, from London, all mention midwives called upon again and again, even when physicians existed. Towns sometimes licensed them officially, recognizing that without them, mortality would soar. But even these licenses carried chains. They often demanded obedience to priests, required reports to city councils, and restricted the remedies women could use. Authority was clipped, hemmed, controlled, let slip in a light joke. One chronicler complained that midwives talked too much during birth, distracting the mother. If only he'd tried giving birth himself, he might have welcomed a few distracting words. The joke, of course, writes itself. Men complaining from the sidelines about processes they'd never endure. Healing outside childbirth fared little better. Women who brewed herbal salves, who treated fevers or stomach pains, risked suspicion. Too successful, and rumours of sorcery spread. Too outspoken, and accusations of charms or devilry followed. A woman curing illness with willow bark might be tolerated. The same woman stopping a fever others failed to treat might be denounced. Knowledge was survival, but it was also dangerous. Still, oral traditions thrived. In cottages, women whispered recipes for remedies, thyme for coughs, mint for stomach aches, comfrey for wounds. They gathered plants at dawn, knowing which leaves worked in spring, which roots to harvest in autumn. Much of modern herbal medicine owes its survival to their hands. Yet their names remain absent, their wisdom absorbed into anonymous folk cures. Think of Hildegard of Bingen again, safely cloistered, writing her books of medicine, because she was a nun. Her remedies were recorded, preserved, celebrated, because countless peasant women were not cloistered. Their remedies faded, forgotten, sometimes stolen by men who recopied them under their own names. Knowledge protected by parchment survived. Knowledge carried in memory vanished. Step back into that birth chamber for a moment. The candles burn low, the cries fade, and at last a baby wails. The midwife smiles, swaddles the child, and lays it against its mother's chest. Around them, relief floods the room. Tears mix with laughter. No guild will honour her. No parchment will bear her name. But in this moment, she has performed a miracle. Multiply that moment by thousands, by millions, and you see the quiet power women held in healing. Power denied the dignity of profession, but power nonetheless. A modern side drifts in. Today we speak of frontline healthcare workers, celebrated in crises, forgotten in calmer times. Medieval midwives would understand that rhythm well, called upon in urgency, dismissed in peace, mistrusted in authority. The cycle hasn't changed as much as we'd like to think. As dusk falls, you leave the cottage, the smell of herbs clinging to your cloak. Behind you, the midwife tidies her tools, readying them for the next knock at the door. Ahead, the university gates stand tall, where men in long gowns argue over humours and anatomy. Two worlds coexist, one official, one invisible. And you realize the profession of medicine, once cradled in women's hands, was stolen away by parchment, seal, and decree. And so midwives, healers, herbalists, the women who knew bodies as intimately as breath, were written out of the book of professions, their knowledge tolerated only when it bowed to men's authority. The irony lingers. The very professions that claim to preserve life began by silencing half the voices that made life possible at all. The sun dips low as you follow the clamour of voices and the clinking of mugs down the crooked lanes toward the taverns. The air is thick with yeast and smoke, the unmistakable perfume of malt brewing in small cauldrons behind half-open shutters. Here is the world of markets and alewives, a space that once belonged almost entirely to women until, slowly and steadily, men claimed the profits and pushed them aside. Picture it clearly. A woman stands in her doorway, her apron dusted with flour, a jug of foaming ale in her hand. On a bench outside, neighbours crowd together, coins clinking on the rough wood. The ale is fresh, warm, nourishing. In a world where water often carried disease, it was safer than a stream. For centuries, brewing was not a craft taught in guilds, but an extension of household work. Women brewed because families needed drink, and any surplus could be sold at the market. It was one of the few trades where women's labour spilled naturally into commerce. At first, towns embraced it. Markets bustled with alewives, their stalls lined with earthenware jugs, their voices sharp as they called out prices. Ballads mention them, chronicles note them. If you walked through London in the 13th century, or Ghent, or York, the smell of women's brewing would hit you as surely as the scent of fresh bread. But success brought danger. As brewing grew more profitable, especially with the introduction of hopped beer from the Low Countries, men entered in force. They formed brewing guilds, they wrote charters, they built larger vats and hired apprentices. Suddenly, women's age-old role was rebranded as unprofessional. Alewives, once central to the drink economy, became mocked, fined, and pushed aside. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval plays often portrayed alewives as cheats, slipping water into beer or short-measuring mugs. Some illustrations even drew them being dragged to hell by demons clutching ale jugs. A bizarre smear campaign in ink. It's as though society needed to demonize them in art before driving them out in law. Meanwhile, men took over brewing, and their product was praised as honest, clean, and worthy of guild oversight. Still, women held on where they could. In smaller villages, brewing remained a household trade well into the late Middle Ages. Picture a woman stirring a steaming mash tun while chickens peck at spilled grain around her feet. Children dart in and out, carrying wood for the fire. She sells pints to neighbours, enough to keep the family afloat. She is entrepreneur, accountant, and brewer rolled into one, but never master brewer, never guild member, never official. Her work is survival, not profession. Markets offered similar half-freedom. Women were common figures in stalls, selling vegetables, bread, thread, second-hand goods. A stroll through a marketplace reveals their cries, mixing with the crowing of roosters, the bleating of sheep, the clang of blacksmiths' hammers nearby. Women hawk eggs, butter, candles. They form the humming background of daily commerce. Yet guilds frowned on this too. In many towns, ordinances restricted how and where women could sell. A wife might trade, but only under her husband's name. A widow might continue briefly, but only until a male heir arrived. Think of the irony. Women's hands provided much of the food and drink in markets, yet legal records list them barely at all. Instead, they appear in fines, punished for selling without license, for brewing illegally, for hawking at the wrong stall. Their presence was everywhere in practice, nowhere in parchment. A light joke softens the bitterness. One chronicler complained that women selling fish in Paris markets talked louder than the bells of Notre Dame. You can almost hear it, a line of women shouting prices over each other, drowning even the cathedral bells. Perhaps it annoyed the chronicler, but it also shows how central their voices were in daily trade. Without them, the market would have been half silent. The transformation of ale from women's craft to men's profession is one of history's clearest examples of economic rebranding. When the product was small-scale and modest, it was women's work. Once it became lucrative, it was absorbed by guilds, its new guardians male. You might call it the medieval version of a corporate takeover. Women pioneered, men monopolized, women vanished. And yet, the memory of alewives lingers in language. Brewster, once a common word for female brewers, clings faintly in old surnames. Spinster likewise traces back to spinners, women earning pennies from thread. These words remind us of professions that women filled abundantly until they were redefined out of existence. Markets also exposed women to suspicion. Their independence unsettled neighbors. A woman too successful at selling bread might be accused of hoarding grain. An alewife whose beer drew crowds might be denounced for watering it down. Accusations carried weight, especially when men sought to clear space for their own entry. It's a pattern you've seen before: suspicion, mockery, restriction, and finally exclusion. Still, women's presence in markets mattered. They earned coin when other avenues were closed. They kept families alive in lean years. They stitched themselves into the fabric of community, not as guildmasters but as persistent sellers. If guilds were fortresses of men, markets were the informal republic of women, noisy, precarious, unprotected, but essential. A modern aside slips in here. Imagine the street vendors of today, hawking food on corners, working long hours without licenses or benefits, necessary to the city's life, yet frowned upon by officialdom. Medieval markets weren't so different, and women carried the brunt of that precarious economy. Step once more into the tavern. The air is warm, thick with smoke and laughter. Men lift mugs, foam dripping down their beards. The ale is good, brewed, more likely than not, by a woman earlier that day. She will never be named in guild records, never praised in chronicles, but her labor fills every mug on the table. And so, as you walk out into the cool night, the truth settles. Alewives and market women were among the most visible workers of medieval towns, their hands shaping the daily life of drink and trade. Yet visibility did not mean recognition. They carried coins in their aprons, but never charters in their names. They held communities together, but society wrote them as cheats, gossips, or widows waiting for heirs. The torches burn low in the square. Stalls are shuttered, mugs emptied, laughter fading into snores, and you realize the marketplace was both a doorway and a dead end. It let women work, earn, survive, but never rise, never belong fully, never be counted as professionals. The square empties slowly, voices fading into the misty night, and you wander toward the courthouse, its heavy doors creaking open on iron hinges. Inside, the chamber smells of wax and damp parchment. A clerk scratches quill across vellum. A judge raises his hand for silence, and men shuffle nervously before benches. This is where disputes are settled, contracts sealed, debts argued, but for women, law itself became another locked profession, another gate they could not pass. Tonight, picture yourself in this hall as a medieval woman. Perhaps you've been cheated at market, your bread seized as too light. Perhaps your neighbor owes you coin. Perhaps your husband is dead, leaving land in dispute. You stand with courage, your apron still stained from chores, but the clerk barely looks up, because here you have no standing of your own. Unless a man, father, husband, brother speaks for you, your words are smoke. The law in much of medieval Europe wrapped women in guardianship. A married woman, known as a fini covert, was legally covered by a husband's identity. She could not sue or be sued alone, could not sign contracts, could not hold property in her name. If she spoke in court, it was often dismissed unless confirmed by a male relative. Imagine living your whole life with your voice legally muted, every word requiring an echo before it carried weight. Only widows had partial freedom. They could appear in court more freely, manage property, sometimes run businesses. Records in English towns show widows suing for debts, defending shops, even hiring lawyers. Yet this autonomy was precarious. It lasted only until remarriage, or until sons claimed inheritance. Independence by widowhood was a crack in the wall, not a doorway. Here's a curious tidbit. In 14th century London, women were sometimes allowed to swear oaths about the quality of ale, because, after all, who knew brewing better? But those oaths were accepted only in ale-related cases. A woman's credibility stretched no further than the jug in her hand. In property disputes, her word was worth little. It's like being allowed to testify only about cookies you baked, but not about the roof over your head. The irony cuts deeper in the professions of law itself. Courts employed clerks, scribes, lawyers, judges, all male. Universities trained men in canon and civil law, a path barred to women from the start. The very system that silenced women was staffed entirely by men who had never heard women's voices as equals in legal debate. No female advocates, no female jurors, no female judges. The balance of justice tilted heavily, and women stood always on the downhill side. Picture a trial. A woman accused of debt stands trembling. Across from her, a man argues loudly, with practiced ease. The judge nods at the man, ignores the woman's stammered words. The scribe dips his quill, noting only the male testimony. The woman's presence lingers in the air, but evaporates on the parchment. History, again, loses her. Sometimes women found workarounds. They whispered petitions through sympathetic men, hired lawyers who spoke on their behalf or leaned on widows' exemptions. In rare cases, women banded together. In Norwich, a group of fishwives protested taxes loudly enough to make chronicles. In Paris, washerwomen formed informal associations to defend their trade. Yet even collective action rarely shifted law's foundation. Authority was male, representation male, decision male. A light joke slips in here, because even heavy walls sometimes creak. A French satire once mocked lawyers as men who sell words as butchers sell meat. Imagine a woman overhearing that, thinking, if words are meat, then surely mine feed families every day. Why shouldn't I sell them too? Yet jokes rarely shifted the parchment reality. The deeper wound is that legal exclusion prevented women from transforming crafts into professions. Imagine a spinner who wanted to form her own company of weavers, or a brewer who wished to secure licenses, or a healer who wished to patent her remedies. Without legal standing, none of it was possible. To be voiceless in law was to be professionless in practice. A modern aside flickers through. Today we take for granted contracts in our own names, signatures valid on bank papers, testimony accepted in courts. Medieval women would have marveled and perhaps laughed bitterly at how long it took to win such a basic right as your word counts. Still, the cracks remained. Noble women by sheer rank sometimes bent the rules. Queens acted as regents, signing edicts. Noble widows managed estates, writing instructions to tenants. Their words carried weight, not because they were women, but because their titles forced respect. Yet these were rare, gilded exceptions, not the pattern of everyday life. Step outside again, into the damped night. The courthouse looms behind you, silent and stern. A woman hurries past, her basket heavy, her steps quick. She too may one day face this hall, not as advocate or judge, but as defendant, witness, widow, or complainant. Never as professional. The bell tolls midnight, echoing through the square. You realize that law, more than any other structure, locked women out of professions. For if you cannot speak in court, cannot hold contracts, cannot sign your name to property, then you cannot claim a profession. You can work endlessly, but the parchment will never say it. And in medieval Europe, what was not written was barely considered real. The courthouse fades behind you as dawn seeps in, pale light sliding across rooftops of slate and tile. Today, your path winds not into humble cottages or noisy markets, but toward palaces and castles where banners ripple above stone towers. Here, among the wealthy and powerful, women sometimes broke through the barriers that stifled their poorer sisters. Yet even queens and noble women wielding authority in halls of marble and gold discovered that power was not the same as profession. Picture a great hall at Westminster or Paris. The fire roars in a hearth tall as two men. Courtiers in silks and furs gather, their whispers weaving gossip as thick as smoke. At the high table sits a queen, a consort with crown and sceptre. Her gaze steady as she surveys ambassadors and nobles. She signs a letter, seals it with wax, gives orders to stewards. In practice, she rules. In theory, her authority flows only through her husband or son. Royal women could command armies, negotiate treaties, manage treasuries. Eleanor of Aquitaine led crusades, acted as regent, and held lands greater than many kings. Isabella of France orchestrated a rebellion that toppled her husband Edward II. Blanche of Castile governed France capably during her son's minority. Their lives prove women were capable of statecraft at the highest levels, yet chroniclers often softened their achievements, calling them helpers, intercessors, or mothers protecting sons. Their political work was dismissed as maternal instinct rather than professional governance. Here's a curious tidbit. In some coronation rituals, queens were anointed with oil, but not on the head, as kings were. Instead, the oil touched only their chest or hands, a symbolic half-sacrament. Even in ceremony, their power was seen as partial, derivative, incomplete. Imagine being handed a crown, but told it's decorative, not authoritative. Noble women lower in rank also wielded significant influence. When lords went to war, wives managed states, oversaw harvests, negotiated with tenants, even defended castles. Chroniclers record Margaret Parston of Norfolk writing letters in the 15th century that reveal her fierce defense of property rights, her haggling with lawyers, her management of armed retainers. She was, in all but name, a professional estate manager, yet history preserved her words only because her letters survived, not because her society considered her role a recognized profession. Contrast that with noblemen's activities. When a man managed land, he was called lord, steward, or administrator. When a woman did the same, she was called lady of the house, her title ceremonial even when her labor was identical. It's like calling one person CEO and the other helpful wife, despite both steering the same company. In rare cases, widowed queens became rulers in their own right. Queens regnant, like Mary of Hungary or Joanna of Naples, sat on thrones, issued decrees and minted coins with their images. But even then, their reigns were often described in gendered terms, chroniclers marveling at how manly or unnatural it was for a woman to rule. Power was tolerated, but treated as an oddity, a break in the natural order. A light joke drifts through the gloom. One medieval poet mocked a ruling queen as a hen among cockerels. The intended insult flips oddly today. After all, hens feed whole barns while roosters mostly strut and crow. Perhaps the poet revealed more truth than he meant. Royal and noble women also patronized arts, literature, and religion. They funded monasteries, commissioned manuscripts, sponsored poets. These roles carried prestige, but again they were framed as extensions of femininity, nurturing, pious, ornamental. A noblewoman might bankroll the building of a cathedral, yet a male bishop would claim the credit at its consecration. She could foster learning, but not claim the title of scholar herself. Step into a private chamber now. A lady sits with a book of hours, its pages illuminated with saints and prayers. She traces the words slowly. Many noble women could read, some even write, a rarity compared to the wider female population. Yet literacy for them was framed as devotion, not intellectual pursuit. A man reading Aristotle was praised as philosopher. A woman reading Psalms was praised as pious. The act was the same, the interpretation skewed. Even in diplomacy, where queens often excelled, their labour was hidden. A marriage alliance might hinge on a queen's negotiation, her careful balancing of factions. She might write letters in her own hand to foreign rulers, smoothing conflict. Yet treaties bore kings' names, not queens. The ink erased her. And then there was motherhood, a role noble women could never escape. Their bodies were dynastic engines, expected to produce heirs. Queens were judged less by their statecraft than by their fertility. A barren queen was considered a political disaster, no matter her talents. Imagine being CEO of a vast kingdom but evaluated on pregnancy charts rather than policy. Still, within these constraints, noble women carved niches of agency. Some acted as patrons of female convents, offering education and sanctuary to other women. Some commissioned chronicles that subtly highlighted women's roles. Some, like Christine de Pizan under Queen Isabeau's patronage, dared to write openly about the dignity and worth of women. These efforts, though small compared to the machinery of male power, sowed seeds of change. A modern aside flickers. Today, we might call such women trailblazers, role models, influencers. In their own time, they were anomalies, praised or vilified but rarely imitated. Society allowed exceptions without dismantling the rules. Walk now through the echoing corridors of a castle at night. Torches sputter, banners sway in draughts. A queen's seal presses hot wax. A lady's voice instructs servants. A widow tallies, rents by candlelight. Each act is professional in all but name. Yet none of these women would be invited to the Guildhall, the university, the courthouse. Their labour remained tied to bloodline and circumstance, not recognized as independent vocation. And so, in the glitter of crowns and the shadows of tapestries, women could hold extraordinary power, but never ordinary profession. Their work shaped kingdoms, raised armies, preserved estates, fostered culture, but history wrote them as mothers, wives, anomalies, never as professionals. The barriers stood, even when women towered over them. As dawn lightens the sky beyond the battlements, you realize royal exceptions proved possibility, but not change. They were stars in the night, brilliant but scattered, unable to illuminate the whole sky of women's lives. For the vast majority, the gates of profession remained closed, no matter how many crowns glittered above a chosen few. The castle towers fade behind you as you tread into darker alleys, where smoke clings heavy to the air, and whispers carry faster than wind. Tonight you find yourself in the uneasy space between necessity and fear, where women who stepped beyond their sanctioned roles often met suspicion, a world where skill could earn coin but also accusation, where practicing medicine, brewing, or charms might be praised one day and condemned as witchcraft the next. Picture a woman bent over her table at dusk. On it lie bundles of dried plants, jars of oils, perhaps a scrap of parchment with a prayer. Neighbours come to her for fevers, for childbirth, for charms to ward off storms. She knows more about bodies than most men with books, because she has watched them falter and heal for decades. She is healer, counsellor, comforter, yet her very competence makes her vulnerable. Too many cures, too much independence, and rumours begin to curl like smoke. Sorcery, witchcraft, unnatural knowledge. The church's stance was complicated. Priests needed midwives and healers, yet warned constantly against superstition. Charms woven into cures were condemned as devilish. A woman reciting prayers over a birth might be tolerated. If she added a rhyme or herb not approved in scripture, suspicion followed. The same act, comforting words, helpful hands, might be labelled holy in one parish and heretical in another. Here's a curious tidbit. In some towns, midwives were sworn in before bishops to ensure they baptized infants if they feared the baby would die before reaching church. That meant women literally carried souls into salvation. Yet the very next breath, those same bishops might warn that women's tongues and remedies leaned toward witchcraft. Trusted to save a soul, distrusted to brew a tea, the contradiction is staggering. As universities spread, male physicians positioned themselves as professionals, branding women's healing as amateur or dangerous. A doctor might dissect a pig in lecture, then scoff at the old woman whose willow bark tea eased pain. And yet modern science tells us willow bark contains salicin, the ancestor of aspirin. The witch with her tea often healed more effectively than the doctor with his theories. Accusations often came when women's independence clashed with men's authority. An alewife who refused guild oversight, a widow who kept brewing profitably, a healer whose remedies drew more clients than licensed doctors, all were easy targets. Whisper campaigns spread, fueled by envy and fear. It didn't help that medieval imagination was thick with demons, charms, and unseen dangers. What better scapegoat than the woman whose work defied categorization? A light joke slips in here. One satirist claimed witches flew on broomsticks because they could not afford horses. The line was meant to mock, but you can almost see the wry humor. Women confined to homes, their broom the symbol of household duty, reimagined as transport, a joke that accidentally reveals the truth. Women turned even tools of drudgery into symbols of possibility. Still, the laughter often soured. Inquisitors' manuals described signs of witchcraft, ointments, charms, knowledge of herbs. Essentially, the toolkit of many working women. In villages, if cattle sickened, if crops failed, suspicion turned swiftly to the woman who sold remedies. Too much skill became dangerous, too little compliance, suspicious. Independence itself was criminalized. Imagine standing in court accused of witchcraft. Neighbors whisper, pointing to your jars of herbs. The judge frowns at the charm you muttered over a sick child. You explain it was a prayer, a tradition, a comfort. But men with quills note incantation, suspicion, guilty. The same hands that once welcomed your cures now push you aside, afraid your knowledge bends toward the devil. The witchcraft trials of the late Middle Ages and beyond built upon this foundation, the long-standing suspicion of women practicing skills outside sanctioned roles. While not every accused woman was a healer or midwife, many were. Their labor, essential yet unrecognized, became vulnerable the moment society sought scapegoats. And yet, for all the fear, communities could not wholly abandon them. Women's healing, brewing, weaving of charms persisted because people needed them. The contradiction remained. Women were too necessary to erase, too threatening to accept. They lived in a liminal space, half valued, half condemned. Think again of the guild halls. Men argued over weights of bread, measures of ale, lengths of cloth. Their authority was public, professional, recorded. Women's work in healing, brewing, or fortune-telling thrived in kitchens, backrooms, cottages. Their authority was whispered, informal, fragile, and when questioned, it was easier to destroy than to legitimize. A modern aside drifts in. Today, alternative medicine often lives in a similar tension, sought by many, mocked by others, sidelined by institutions. Medieval women would nod knowingly. They'd seen it all before. Step out into the village square. The gossip is loud tonight. Someone's cow has died. Someone's child has fever. The midwife is praised in one corner, cursed in another. A healer's brew is lauded, then mocked. A woman selling charms is laughed at, then feared. Professions that men barred women from reappeared here in shadows. where women practiced unofficially, dangerously. They worked not because they were allowed, but because they were needed, and therein lies the tragedy. What might have been recognized professions, medicine, pharmacy, brewing, counseling, became framed as crimes when women practiced them outside control. Professional exclusion did not just deny women advancement, it transformed their skills into risks, their labor into liabilities, their wisdom into reasons for suspicion. As night closes in, you pass a cottage where herbs hang drying from beams, casting long shadows in torchlight. Inside, a woman whispers to her daughter, which leaves heal, which roots soothe, which prayers calm. The knowledge passes on, fragile but enduring. Outside, the world sharpens its suspicion, and you realize, for medieval women, stepping outside the narrow script of wife or nun meant walking a knife's edge, too skilled, too visible, too independent, and you risked accusation. Professions denied became professions criminalized, and so the story of women and work in this age was not only about doors closed, but also about doors that when pushed open revealed not opportunity but danger. The torches sputter in the town square, and you wander outward again, away from guild halls, courts, and castles. The road turns muddy, fields open wide, and the air grows sharper with the scent of dung and tilled earth. Here lies the backbone of medieval society, the village, and here women's labor was constant, visible, and essential, yet never recognized as profession. For peasants, survival blurred all lines between work and life. Women did nearly everything men did, and often more besides, but the law and culture still wrote them as helpers, not as professionals. Picture the village at dawn. Smoke rises from low-roofed huts thatched with straw. Roosters crow, dogs bark, cattle stir in wooden pens. A woman steps out, her skirts hitched, her feet bare in the mud. She carries a pail to the well, hauls water, sets it by the hearth, then stoops to milk the cow. Before the sun is high, she has baked bread, fed pigs, combed flax, and sent children to chase geese. Her husband trudges to the Lord's fields, but she has already laboured hours before his plough touches earth. And she does not stop there. Women work the fields too, weeding, planting, harvesting, threshing. In harvest season they swung sickles from dawn to dusk, their backs stooped, hands blissed, songs were sung to keep rhythm, children ran between rows, and the grain piled up only because both men and women sweated side by side. Yet chronicles, written by monks and clerks, note only men harvest, women's bent backs vanish from parchment, though without them, famine would have followed. Here's a curious tidbit. In some manorial records, women are listed performing ploughing, a task often imagined as men's work. Yet when husbands were away or oxen scarce, women guided the plough, trudging through mud behind beasts. They were not praised as farmers, but noted as wives of or widows of, their labour recorded, their identity erased. Household tasks, too, stretched endlessly. Women spun wool by the fire at night, their fingers raw. They brewed ale in small tubs, baked coarse loaves, made cheese from goat's milk, dyed thread with herbs. They stitched clothing, patched shoes, mended tools. If something broke, they fixed it. If food was short, they stretched it. Their ingenuity was the invisible glue of village survival. And yet, all this was seen as duty, not profession. The man was called ploughman, carpenter, shepherd. The woman was simply wife. Even unmarried women who worked as servants or day labourers were rarely named beyond maid. The work might be backbreaking, the skill real, but the title never dignified it. A light joke slips in. One medieval proverb quipped, "A ploughman's wife works harder than the plough." Hard truth wrapped in humour. She hauled, spun, fed, bore children, all without recognition. The joke was meant lightly, but the truth behind it is heavier than the plough itself. Village women also carried burdens beyond work. They bore children constantly, 4, 6, 10, often while continuing to labor. Imagine harvesting barley with an infant swaddled on your back, older children tugging your skirts, and still being expected to finish your row before dusk. Their lives were ceaseless motion, their exhaustion unrecorded, their deaths in childbirth barely noted in parish books. And yet, despite the hardships, women formed the social fabric of villages. At wells they traded gossip and news. At ovens they shared bread and advice. At harvests they sang together, their voices carrying over fields. Informal networks of women's knowledge, humor, and solidarity ran parallel to men's councils and manorial courts. It was profession of a different kind, not recognized by lords but sustaining communities nonetheless. Occasionally, peasant women stepped beyond expected roles. Some became reeves' assistants, managing village labor obligations. Some acted as witnesses in disputes when men were absent. Some even joined revolts. In the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, women marched alongside men, their voices loud in rebellion. Yet chroniclers often ignored them, or mocked them as shrill. Once again, presence did not equal recognition. A modern aside whispers in, "Today we debate the gender gap in wages." Medieval peasants knew a harsher version. Women's labor was assumed free, woven into survival, unpaid because it could not be separated from life itself. No ledger ever counted the worth of a wife who spun through the night, so her children would not shiver. Still, evidence glimmers in manorial accounts. In times of crisis, women hired as day laborers earned wages, often half of what men made for the same task. Weeding, reaping, carrying, all done for coin. Yet the coin was smaller, the recognition absent. Imagine two workers bent in the same field, blades swinging in unison, yet one is paid pennies while the other is praised as farmer. Here's another tidbit. Archaeologists digging village sites have found spindle whorls, loom weights, brewing pots in nearly every home. They are evidence of industries that defined medieval life. Women were the unseen manufacturers of Europe, their tools scattered in soil long after their names vanished. Night falls over the village now. Fires flicker through shutters, cows low in barns, dogs curl at thresholds. Inside huts, women still spin, their wheels humming. Children doze on straw, men snore from ale, but women's hands remain busy in firelight. Profession? No. Essential. Always. And so, in villages, women's realities shine clear. They worked as much as men, often more, carrying the double burden of field and home. Yet the language of profession, farmer, brewer, shepherd, craftsman, passed them by. They were the invisible half of medieval labor, remembered only in fragments, their professions unnamed because society refused to grant them that dignity. As you leave the village, the night sky spreads wide, stars glittering above silent fields. You realize, if guilds and courts excluded women, peasant life at least admitted their labor. But admission without recognition is a hollow victory. Their sweat built the village, yet the parchment remained blank where their profession should have been written. The fields fade behind you as your steps trace the ruts of a long dirt road, the wind carrying scents of salt and tar. Ahead lies a port town, its docks bristling with masts, its alleys loud with cries in half a dozen tongues. Here, among travellers and traders, women sometimes slipped the bonds of expectation. A few crossed borders as merchants, sailors, or pilgrims. Their stories are rare, fragile threads in a tapestry dominated by men, but they shine all the brighter for their rarity. Picture the harbour at dawn. Nets drip seawater, barrels of herring clatter, and the air reeks of fish, sweat, and pitch. A woman steps onto the quay, her cloak wrapped tight, her basket laden with spices or cloth. She haggles in quick words, balancing scales, counting coins. Most around her are men, but she holds her ground. Merchant widows especially appear here, carrying on husbands' trades, their names fleetingly inked in customs rolls. They buy, they sell, they cross the Channel or the Baltic with goods. For a moment, they inhabit the world of profession, even if society calls it survival. Take the Hanseatic League, that great web of northern trade. Its records are overwhelmingly male, yet scattered mentions of women appear, widows transporting goods, daughters entrusted with cargo, sisters managing shops while brothers sailed. They never gained the title of merchant formally, but in practice they kept the wheels turning. Imagine the courage it took, boarding ships where storms tore sails, entering markets where foreign tongues buzzed, facing suspicion in every port, yet persisting. Here's a curious tidbit. In 14th century Paris, some women ran stalls, selling imported luxuries, silk, pepper, saffron. City statutes sometimes restricted them, but their presence was undeniable. One record even praises a widow who knew the worth of cloth better than many men. It is the closest thing to a compliment medieval commerce could manage, grudging but real. And then there were pilgrims, women who travelled not for profit but for piety. Pilgrimage was one of the few journeys open to women without scandal, though even then suspicion lurked. Imagine trudging hundreds of miles to Santiago or Canterbury, your feet blistered, your purse light, your prayers constant. Women walked those paths too, often alone, sometimes in groups. They traded along the way, swapped goods for shelter, carried relics home. In their journeys, they glimpsed worlds beyond their villages, markets, ports, monasteries, experiences men monopolized in official records, but women quietly shared in practice. Sailors? That tale is rarer still, but not absent. Chronicles whisper of women disguised as men aboard ships, working ropes and sails. The sea, like guild halls, was deemed unfitting for women. Yet storms and wars made disguises tempting. A woman who lost her husband might cut her hair, bind her chest, and labor anonymously. Legends blur fact, but they hint at determination. If professions barred the way, some women changed clothes to pass unseen. A light joke slips here. One seafarer's tale mocks a woman sailor, who when asked to haul a rope replied, "I'll haul, but only if it minds its manners." The joke was meant to ridicule, but it betrays a deeper truth, that men could imagine women aboard only through satire. The possibility was laughed at, because laughter was safer than admission. Trade also crossed inland routes. In fairs at Champagne, in markets at Bruges, women sometimes handled booths, selling cloth or cheese, even larger wares if they were widows. Records show women paying stall fees, small but telling. A merchant's wife might accompany him, her keen eye for accounts making the difference between profit and loss. Yet the ledger always bore his name. Her labor was currency without signature. Sometimes women travelers attracted scorn. Chroniclers sneered at women who wandered too far, accusing them of licentiousness. To travel was to risk reputation, for mobility itself was coded as masculine. Yet without such journeys, trade would falter. A wife carrying cloth to the next town was performing economic labor, not scandal, though the parchment never framed it so. A modern side creeps in. Today, business travel is mundane. Imagine trying to explain to a medieval woman that boarding a plane alone for a work conference carries no shame. She might laugh or weep at how easily we now cross borders that cost her reputation centuries ago. Back at the docks, you hear languages crash together: Flemish, French, German, Norse. Women's voices are few, but they echo nonetheless. A widow bargaining for herring, a pilgrim asking passage to a shrine, a seller of herbs seeking foreign buyers. These voices, though scattered, prove women were not entirely bound to hearth and field. They carved narrow lanes of trade, pressed open cracks in the doors of commerce. But society never called them professionals. Merchant, sailor, trader, those words clung stubbornly to men. Women remained wives, widows, daughters, their economic labor always tethered to family ties. If a woman traded boldly, she was admired cautiously. If she profited too well, suspicion shadowed her. If she traveled too far, she risked whispers of sin. Profession was not just skill, but reputation, and women were denied the second no matter how much they proved the first. Here's another tidbit. In Lübeck, a town of the Hanseatic League, women were barred from guilds, but could still pay harbour fees. Their names appear only as the widow of, or the daughter of. Yet those payments show they shipped goods. The parchment half erases them, but the ink still whispers. They were there. Night falls over the port. Ships creak in the tide. Lanterns sway on masts. Sailors sing coarse songs. In the shadows, a woman counts coins in her apron. Her day's sails modest but vital. Tomorrow she'll return, perhaps mocked, perhaps ignored, but determined. And so, in travel and trade, women found cracks in the wall of exclusion. They walked roads, crossed seas, bartered in markets, carried goods across borders. Yet they did so precariously, allowed by loophole, tolerated by need, dismissed by law. They were never professionals, only shadows in the margins of trade. The waves lap against the quay, the stars glitter above, cold and distant. And you realize, women moved more than history admits. Their footsteps lined roads, their voices rang in markets, their hands exchanged goods, but the parchment called them nothing more than wives and widows. The profession of merchant, sailor, or trader remained locked, even as women lived it in practice. The sound of the sea lingers behind you as you wander inland again, your path curling into towns where shutters rattle against the night and narrow streets echo with faint strains of music. Here, professions not tied to guild halls or courts survive in quieter, stranger corners. Textiles spun fine as spiderwebs, songs carried on lutes, plays whispered on makeshift stages. Women sometimes thrived in these realms of silk, song, and shadows. Yet even here, their work was precarious, praised as talent, but rarely acknowledged as profession. Picture a chamber lit by rushlights. A girl sits at a frame, her needle moving quick as heartbeat, gold thread flashing in the dim. She embroiders a banner for a nobleman, saints and beasts springing to life beneath her hand. Hours pass, her back stiffens, her eyes blur when the banner is carried in procession. Its brilliance astonishes. Chroniclers note the noble's generosity, the beauty of the design. Her name never appears. In the records, she is simply a maid who stitched. Textile work offered women rare avenues for recognition, yet only half-open doors. Weaving guilds barred them, but embroidery and silk were often deemed feminine arts. In England, noble ladies prided themselves on embroidery, even founding workshops. Queen Matilda of Flanders was said to have supervised the Bayeux tapestry's creation, though the hands that stitched it were almost certainly countless anonymous women. Their artistry survives, but their identities dissolve. Imagine a masterpiece hanging in a museum today, with no artist credited, only done by women. That was medieval reality. Here's a curious tidbit. In 14th century London, silk women appear in records as silk wives. They wove delicate ribbons and veils, sometimes organizing in loose groups. They never gained guild status, yet their goods fetched high prices. Men praised the beauty of silk, but distrusted the independence of those who made it. The irony? Male merchants grew rich, selling silk that women wove. The profits were gilded, the weavers were forgotten. Music offered another path. Though it too carried risks, women sang in convents, their voices soaring in plain song that filled stone chapels. Nuns composed chants, like Hildegard of Bingen's, ethereal works which survive even now. But outside cloisters, music was a shadowed career. Female minstrels travelled Europe, their songs woven with stories, but they were often branded loose or untrustworthy. A woman with a lute on her back risked more than fatigue. She risked her reputation. Still, some flourished. Records mention female troubadours, the troubarets of southern France, who composed verses as intricate as any man's. One wrote of love's pain with words that still cut across centuries. Yet they were exceptions, their names footnotes rather than headlines. Male troubadours filled courts. Women slipped in rarely, their songs surviving like scattered pearls. Theatre, too, gave women fleeting visibility. Street plays, mystery cycles, travelling troupes, women sometimes acted, sang or danced, but official companies barred them, insisting men play all roles, even female ones. Imagine watching a bearded actor in a gown, while talented women looked on from the crowd, forbidden to step on stage. The absurdity was so ingrained that it lasted centuries, well into early modern times. A light joke flickers here. One medieval commentator warned that if women acted on stage, the audience might mistake play for reality, as if men in wigs and dresses were more convincing. The joke lies in the blindness, women's exclusion justified with reasons more comical than credible. In courts and noble houses, women could sometimes practice arts as patrons or performers. A duchess might sponsor poets, a queen might maintain musicians, yet their work was framed as pastime, not profession. A noblewoman singing was graceful, a minstrel singing for coin was suspect. One praised as virtue, the other condemned as vice. Step into a shadowed street now. Torches flicker on makeshift stages, where players perform tales of saints or devils. The crowd cheers, coins clatter. Behind the curtain, a woman waits, not to act, but to hand costumes, to stitch props, to sing softly when no one listens. Her labor props the stage, but never earns the spotlight. Yet even in shadows, women's creativity shaped medieval culture. Songs sung at hearths, lullabies whispered in cradles, embroidery hung in churches, plays recited at festivals. These works lingered long after names vanished. If guilds kept parchment, women kept memory, threading art into daily life. A modern aside rises. Today, debates about unpaid creative labor echo these histories. Women paint, sing, write, yet their work is often dismissed as hobby unless monetized. Medieval women would recognize this instantly. For them, artistry was praised but rarely professionalized. Consider the Bio tapestry again. 70 meters long, bursting with detail, one of the most celebrated artifacts of the age. Its stitches tell of conquest, ships, battles. It is a work of extraordinary skill, yet historians still debate who made it, because no names were recorded. Likely dozens of women bent over frames, stitching until fingers bled. Their hands created a masterpiece, yet history filed it under anonymity. The tapestry is famous. Its makers remain shadows. Here's another tidbit. In Florence, silk workshops employed women by the hundreds. Their pay was low, their recognition minimal, yet their labor built one of Europe's most profitable industries. Travelers praised Florentine silk. Merchants grew wealthy, bankers thrived. The women who wove the threads never appeared in ledgers as professionals. They were girls of the workshop, faceless, replaceable. As night deepens, you pass a window where soft music drifts. A girl plucks a lute, her voice trembling as she sings. Perhaps her family praises her. Perhaps a neighbor listens. She will not travel to court. She will not be hired as minstrel. She will not be remembered. But her song fills this moment with beauty. And so, in silk, in song, in theatre's shadows, women carved space to create. Their artistry was everywhere, in banners that fluttered at war, in chants that echoed in cloisters, in silks that dazzled nobles, in plays that stirred crowds, but profession, the title, the pay, the recognition belonged to men. Women's art was praised, consumed, adored, but almost never acknowledged as labour. The torches gutter in the square. The music fades, the looms fall silent, the embroidery frame leans against the wall. You walk on, realizing that medieval women lived as artists, weavers, singers, actresses, but the parchment called them none of these. Their professions were transformed into pastimes, their genius into grace, their labour into shadows. The faint strains of song fade into memory as you walk deeper into the shifting world of the late Middle Ages. The streets are busier now, stone houses rising taller, markets spilling wider, the hum of commerce swelling. The 14th and 15th centuries brought upheaval, plague, war, famine, rebellion. And in those cracks, women began edging toward roles that looked just a little more like professions. Still fragile, still contested, but visible enough to hint at change. Picture the aftermath of plague. Entire villages hollowed, workshops shuttered, guild rolls thinned, the Black Death scythed through Europe, killing 1 in 3, sometimes more. With so many men gone, women stepped into voids. A brewer's wife took the vat, a mason's daughter hauled stone, a clerk's widow kept the accounts. Necessity loosened the rules. For a while nobody asked whether a woman should, only whether she could. And she could. In England, manorial records after 1348 note women holding more land, taking on leases, managing farms, some even signed contracts in their own names. In German towns, women appeared more often in tax rolls, evidence of independent economic activity. Crisis cracked open space, yet as populations recovered, guilds and councils moved to shut doors again, tightening statutes, reasserting male privilege. It was as if women's wartime or plague time work was tolerated only until men returned. Here's a curious tidbit. In 15th century London, silk women organized into what was almost a proto-guild. They met, set prices, defended their craft. Though the city never granted them full recognition, the fact that they tried shows ambition pressing against boundaries. Imagine a circle of women by candlelight, tallying accounts, swearing loyalty, imitating the guilds that denied them. They understood the game. They simply weren't invited to the table. Still, cracks deepened. Christine de Pizan, writing in Paris around 1405, made her living by her pen, perhaps the first European woman to do so professionally. Widowed, she turned to writing poems, histories, defences of women. Patrons paid her, manuscripts circulated, her name survived. She wrote bitterly about men who mocked her. They say it is not fitting for a woman to write, but she wrote anyway, her very survival proof that women could carve professions if they dared. Noble and royal women too stretched boundaries. Isabella of Castile later ruled Spain in her own right, overseeing armies and reforms. Margaret of Anjou led English forces during the Wars of the Roses. Such figures startled chroniclers, praised, feared, or ridiculed, but never ignored. Their prominence whispered to ordinary women that gendered lines were not natural law, but human decree. A light joke flickers here. One late medieval satirist complained that women are everywhere now, in shops, in taverns, even in courts. He meant it as mockery, but read centuries later, it feels almost celebratory. Women were indeed everywhere, whether men admitted it or not. Urban life helped. Towns grew, commerce expanded, and with it came demand for labour. Women washed cloth in rivers, sold fruit in markets, stitched garments in workshops. Some rose to modest independence. Records from Paris show women owning taverns. In Bruges, a few women traded cloth directly. In London, widow brewers ran alehouses large enough to hire servants. They never received guild honours, but they carved niches of livelihood. Education, too, inched wider. Some towns allowed girls to attend elementary schools at least long enough to learn to read vernacular. Wealthier families sometimes hired tutors for daughters. Literacy remained rare, but it spread just enough that women could copy accounts, read prayers, even compose letters. Margaret Paston's surviving letters from 15th century England reveal a woman managing estates, bargaining with lawyers, even directing armed men. Her pen shows a woman not just surviving, but commanding. Yet the backlash was strong. The same centuries that saw women edge forward also birthed louder condemnations. Preachers railed that women were out of place, that their tongues wagged too freely in markets, that their ambitions threatened order. Guilds tightened their rules, universities reinforced bans, councils limited licenses. It was a tug of war, cracks opening, then patched with firmer mortar. Think of the theatre again. By the late Middle Ages, mystery plays filled city squares, elaborate performances involving whole communities. Women acted in some of them, despite official bans. Records from York list female performers in guild plays. They walked onto stages, spoke lines, embodied roles. They were not supposed to, but they did. It's a reminder, parchment rules were one thing, lived reality another. A modern aside rises. Today we talk of glass ceilings. Medieval women faced stone walls, yet still found windows cracks, even ladders against the side. They leaned through whenever crisis or loophole allowed. Here's another tidbit. In Florence, widows could sometimes join the Wool Guild as honorary members, allowed to manage small shops. Their status was temporary, but many managed for decades. The fiction of temporary masks the reality. Women sustained industries even while barred from recognition. Late medieval art hints at change too. Illuminated manuscripts begin to show women reading, even teaching. Paintings depict women at desks, quills in hand. These images did not reflect common reality. Most women remained illiterate, but they suggest imagination shifting. People could at least picture women learning. The seed of profession begins with imagination. Step now into a London tavern around 1450. The air is thick with smoke. The bench is crowded. At the counter stands a woman, the owner, a widow, who kept the business after her husband died. She pours ale, counts coin, orders supplies. Men grumble that she talks too sharply, but they drink her ale all the same. In practice, she is tavern keeper, merchant, accountant. In parchment, she is widow of John. Still, she works, she survives, she thrives. Night falls, and you walk past workshops where looms clatter, the rhythms steady. Inside, women guide shuttles, children fetch bobbins, men tally cloth. The line between male and female labor blurs in reality, even as guilds insist it must remain sharp. The truth is simple. Without women, industries collapse. The lie is powerful. Women do not belong to professions. And so the late Middle Ages reveal both fragility and persistence. Women cracked barriers in plague years, in widowhood, in workshops, in writing. They carved niches in taverns, in silk, in letters. They glimpsed what professional identity might look like, not hobby, not duty, but livelihood with skill and pride. And each time men moved to push them back. Yet the cracks could not be wholly sealed. The memory of Christine de Pizan's pen, of Margaret Paston's letters, of silk women's gatherings, of actresses in guild plays, these lingered. They whispered to the centuries ahead, proof that the walls could be breached. The bell tolls midnight again. Streets quiet, workshops dark, taverns emptied. You walk through the hush, realizing that the medieval order was never as solid as it pretended. Women pressed against its edges constantly, and the edges strained. The long unraveling had begun, thread by stubborn thread. The streets fall silent as you step once more into the hush of night. Torches gutter low, shutters close, and the whole medieval town seems to fold into itself like a tired beast. It is here, in the quiet, that reflection comes easiest. You have walked through guild halls, where doors closed firmly, convent walls where learning was caged, cottages where work blurred into duty, and marketplaces where women's voices rang out, but never earned parchment recognition. You have seen queens wield crowns yet still be called exceptions, midwives save lives yet still be doubted, alewives brew profit only to be mocked, peasants toil endlessly without title. Now the journey draws to its end, and what remains is the long, slow wind down, a soft accounting of centuries of barriers and the endurance beneath them. Tonight, picture a candle burning low on a wooden table. Wax pools thick, flame wavers. The air smells of smoke and rushes. A woman leans close, her face lit gold by the dying fire. Around her lies the evidence of her day, a spindle of half-finished thread, a jug of ale, a child's toy carved from scrap wood, a torn garment waiting to be mended. These objects are her resume, though no one will ever call it that. Each one shows skill, necessity, patience. Each one is a profession in all but name. Yet the law will not honour her. The guild will not admit her. The university will not train her. She lives surrounded by work, yet outside the world of profession. That is the paradox of medieval womanhood. To live in a society utterly dependent on women's labour, while writing them out of the very structures that defined labour, profession was a gate, and the gatekeepers insisted women stand outside. Still, the truth is that women never stopped working, never stopped shaping. Their hands wove, their voices sang, their knowledge healed. They carved lives out of exclusion, and sometimes, when cracks widened, they stepped briefly inside, proving they could stand as merchants, writers, rulers, scholars. If only for a season. The system wrote them out, but life wrote them in. Here's a curious tidbit to carry into the quiet. In 15th century wills, women often left detailed instructions about tools, looms, brewing vats, spinning wheels. They passed them to daughters or nieces, recognizing these implements as legacies. Men left swords, books, lands. Women left the means of labor. Their wills tell us what society ignored. They knew their work mattered, and they wanted it remembered, a light joke to soften the ache. One medieval moralist sniffed that a woman's proper tool is the distaff, not the pen. You can almost see the smirk, but centuries later we remember Christine de Pizan's pen, not his smugness. The joke has not aged well. As the centuries edged toward their close, the stage was set for change. The Renaissance, Reformation, and eventually modernity would bring new cracks in old walls. Not freedom, not equality, not yet, but movements forward. The daughters of spinners and alewives would one day enter guilds, universities, professions. The slow unravelling you traced tonight was the beginning of that long path. Now the candle burns lower. The woman by the table lifts her child from straw, lays him gently beside her, and sighs into the dark. She may not have title, parchment, or guild oath, but she has done the work of 10 professions in one day. Tomorrow she will do it again, and you, lying in your own bed, centuries later, can let her story settle softly. For every door barred, every wall raised, every parchment that ignored her, she persisted. Her thread ran beneath the fabric of history, unseen but unbroken. So, let the pacing slow now. The fire's crackle softens, the air cools. Imagine the hush of fields under moonlight, the ripple of a stream in darkness, the distant hoot of an owl. Each sound is steady, calming, patient. The weight of centuries loosens, falls away like dust from old vellum. Breathe slowly. Shoulders relax. The long journey through guild halls, convents, courts, taverns, and fields is done. What remains is not the exclusion, but the endurance. Women could not join most professions, but they lived, worked, created, sustained nonetheless. And in the quiet, Their legacy still hums, soft as a spindle turning, steady as a lullaby. So close your eyes. Let the candle gutter into darkness. Let the centuries fade. You are safe here, listening, resting, drifting. Good night.